Hotep. Welcome to Journey in the Self. I'm your host, Sarah. As you know, we've been doing a long series on Donald Trump, outsider or establishment. You also know that I'm a spiritual teacher, and all things being equal, I would like this to be a spiritually focused show. But we also know, and I've pointed out, that spirituality is not an escape from life, that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. We're here in the divine drama of God, and we all have our parts to play in the divine drama. And it's for us to, part of our path is to identify what our contribution is, what part we're supposed to play in the divine drama, and surrender to it. So part of my surrendering is recognizing what it is that I'm supposed to be doing in any particular moment. And so this seems to have fallen into my hands to do. This is work that one of my mentors, Brother Steve Coakley, did. There aren't that many people in our community doing this type of work. And I do consider this to be part of the spiritual undertaking because we deal with our inner spiritual journey, but we also have a spiritual journey for all of humanity. And so while it is upon us as individuals to transcend our attachment to our lower self and ascend to our higher self, that same journey is part of what is to undergo for humanity as a whole. And so it's humanity's rise out of the darkness into the light. And to that end, that's part of what we're doing with this series, exposing the darkness and bringing it to light. I think we're on part 13 of our series, Donald Trump, outsider or establishment. Correct me if I'm wrong, Brother Jamal. And it's probably going to take a lot more to unpack all the information. So some of the information we will have covered, but I like to also bring in other sources of information. Brother Jamal says we're on part 15 now. I like to bring in other sources of information. We've been culling information as of recent from the Fitzpatrick review, I believe it is. But we're going to expand outside of that. I think we've culled enough information from there. So we're going to go into some information I came upon. It's older information, but it's relevant to our topic because it corroborates information that we've gone through before, noting both Donald Trump's and Epstein's connections to the establishment, otherwise known as the deep state. We'll also see that some of these connections are also in common with some connections that Democrats have. And part of our thesis, if you will, is that the Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, they're just two sides of the same coin. So we want to dispel the myth of choice. It is essentially the same thing because they're controlled by the same people. Okay, so we'll document this as we go through it, and we have been doing just that, documenting those connections. And so we'll present some corroborating uh, evidence of that, and also bring it forward to the current moment with people who are currently in Donald Trump's administration, also further identifying the connections between the establishment, which includes organized crime figures, of course, includes Zionist Israel connection. It includes uh, intelligence agencies. So we'll go on and establish those connections to make it clear that Donald Trump is not an outsider by any stretch of imagination. Um, he's not here to drain the swamp. He's part of the swamp. So we'll go ahead and present our first piece of information source. Okay, so this is from an article written back in 2019 by Whitney Webb, who is the author of this book, One Nation Under Blackmail. And she's done an exceptional job of demonstrating the connections that both Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein have in common, and also tying them back to the establishment that goes back decades. Okay, so this article was written in 2019 for Mint Press, the Mint News rather, Mint Press News. And I will go through some of the information. I'm not going to read it all, but we'll read some of the key information in here. This is back when Epstein had been convicted. It says, despite his sweetheart deal and having seemingly evaded justice, billionaire sex offender Jeffrey Epstein was arrested earlier this month on federal charges for sex trafficking minors. Epstein's arrest has again brought increased media attention to many of his famous friends, the current president amongst them. It points out that investigations have made it clear that Epstein was running a blackmail operation, whether at his New York mansion or his Caribbean island getaway. Both of those locations had microphones and cameras to record everything that had gone on there, particularly those that involved famous people, well connected people, people who would be considered amongst the the elites, political figures, those who came to both of his properties, who were inclined to and attracted to young girls, and often and sometimes young boys. They were photographed with the ultimate objective of being able to obtain political leverage on these people. So it says that they recorded the salacious interactions that transpired between his guests and underage girls that Epstein exploited, and he appears to have stored much of that blackmail in a safe on this private island. Now, what this article is going to do is to demonstrate that the practice of gathering sensitive information on political figures, on members of the elite, such as royalty, that this has been a practice that goes back decades, back to the beginning of the establishment, truly, of the Zionist power in this country, to be honest, because it goes back to even the time of the founding of the Federal Reserve, which we know was started by Paul Warburg in this country, who was an agent of the Rothschild family, who is the principal financier of the Zionist movement. So the article will identify some of these recurring themes of gathering sensitive information on the well connected, often sexual blackmail, compromising information that can be used to manipulate people. It says claims of Epstein's links and involvement in a sophisticated, well-funded sexual blackmail operation have surprisingly spurred few media outlets to examine the history of intelligence agencies both in the U.S. and abroad conducting similar blackmail operations, many of which involved underage prostitutes. So it says in part one of this investigation, Mint Press will examine how a mob-linked businessman with deep ties to the notorious gangster Meyer Lansky developed close ties with the FBI while also running a sexual blackmail operation for decades, which became a covert part of the anti-communist crusade of the 1950s, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who is also known throughout Washington for having a habit of drunkenly groping underage teenage girls. He goes on to say one of McCarthy's key aides would take over the ring that McCarthy had established and expanded the sexual blackmail operation. At the same time, he expanded his own political influence, which ended up leading to putting him in close contact with prominent figures, including Donald Trump, and ultimately um, put him in contact with Ronald Reagan, and ultimately with Donald Trump. And we'll see that there's a a string that connects and binds Epstein to these people engaged in that type of intelligence gathering operation. Okay, we've talked in the past about Samuel Bronfman and his connection to the mafia. We know that Bronfman achieved his fortune during Prohibition when alcohol sales were prohibited in the United States. He bootlegged liquor during this period and established distilleries. And when Prohibition ended, had a significant advantage and began to basically dominate the alcohol industry. His company ended up being Seagram's. And it says during Prohibition, he used loopholes to skirt the law and found technically legal ways to sell alcohol. It goes on to talk about some of the connections that the Bronfman family had with organized crime figures. So it says here, key to Bronfman's success during the American Prohibition were ties his family cultivated organized crime. Some of those people included Charles Lucky Luciano, Mo Dalitz, Abner Longley, Zwillman, and Meyer Lansky. You will note from the many of the last names, you will note that these are Jewish names, which also dispels a myth about the nature of organized crime being primarily Italian. It was both Italian and Jewish dominated, but you won't see that depiction in the media because the media is dominated by Jews, Zionists, as is documented in the book uh, An Empire of Their Own, how the Jews created Hollywood. So, and this is a book that was written by them, proud of that fact. Okay, so it says that most of Bronfman's mob associates during the Prohibition were members of what became the National Crime Syndicate. During that investigation, that was known as the Kefauver Committee, some of the biggest names in the mafia named Bronfman as a central figure in their bootlegging operations. The widow of the notorious American mob boss Meyer Lansky, who again was a Jew, even recounted how Bronfman had thrown lavish dinners for her husband. The dinners end up becoming a significant part in the story here. Through the ties to organized crime, that would end up leading to a close association with Leslie Wexner, who you remember is the person with whom Jeffrey Epstein was connected and ended up being his primary sponsor in seed, giving him seed money to begin his operations. He ended up managing having power of attorney essentially over Leslie Wexner's fortune, which ended up being a means to finance many of the things that Epstein was involved in, including his money management business. So it says Samuel Bronfman would go on to associate closely with Leslie Wexner, allegedly the source of much of Epstein's mysterious wealth, and other mobbing philanthropists, and some would even manage their own sexual blackmail operations, including the recently busted blackmail based in that part is not available. Okay, so we talks about a gentleman named Louis Rosenstein, and he was one of the key people, middlemen, to help facilitate Bronfman's bootlegging operation. It goes on to provide some background information about Rosenstein, which we will not go into, other than to say again he helped facilitate the distribution of Bronfman's liquor, playing the part of a middleman. Subsequent New York State legislative investigations would allege that Rosenstein was part of a consortium with underworld figures that brought liquor into Canada, whose other members were Meyer Lansky, who we talked about, Joseph Fusco, an associate of Al Capone, Joseph Lindsay, a Boston man named Mr. Kelly, later identified as a convicted bootlegger. Rosenstein's relationship with these men, particularly Lansky, would continue long after Prohibition, and Samuel Bronfman, for his part, would also maintain his mob ties. If you will recall, in probably, I think, going back to episode 2 or part 2 of this series, we talked about the fact that Meyer Lansky was a shareholder of the Mary Carter Paint Company, which owned Resorts, or which ended up becoming Resorts International, who sold the casino, the Florida casino, to Donald Trump. So we see a direct tie between Bronfman, organized crime, Epstein, and Meyer Lansky. And you'll see the connection between Epstein and these figures as we go on, and you'll be able to see the connections that both Donald Trump and Epstein have with the same principal figures. Okay, now you go on to see that Rosenstein, in addition to establishing close relationships with organized crime, also cultivated a close tie with the FBI. In particular, established a good close relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, and that'll become significant as we go on through the information. But those of us who've done research into J. Edgar Hoover knows that he was compromised because he was gay. He was known to go to these sex parties where he was compromised. And you'll see later that Meyer Lansky ended up gathering some of that information from those sex parties to use as leverage against J. Edgar Hoover, which is the reason why J. Edgar Hoover never investigated organized crime. Okay, it goes on to say Rosenstiel was known for his erratic and monstrous behavior towards his employees. Such differences between Bronfman and Rosenstiel were also reflected in their personal lives. Bronfman was married once. Rosenstiel was married 5 times and was known for his relatively closeted bisexual antics, a part of his life that was well known to many of his close associates and employees. During one of the divorce proceedings with one of his fourth wife, Susan Kaufman, she alleged that Rosenstiel hosted extravagant parties. He organized these parties, but he also made sure that they were bugged with microphones that recorded the antics of his high profile guests. So again, we see this pattern emerging going back to the prohibition era of individuals connected to intelligence and organized crime who were themselves sexual deviants, but held parties where this type of activity went on and recorded those parties in order to gain compromising information on key figures, which would be used, of course, to manipulate and control them. So again, this would end up leading to the activities that Epstein was engaged in, and you'll see that here later in the chapter or in the paragraph. So it says those audio recordings Kaufman alleged were then kept for the purpose of blackmail. The Kaufman's claims are shocking. Her testimony was deemed credible and held in high regard by the former chief counsel of the crime committee, New York Judge Edwin McLaughlin, the committee investigator William Gallinaro, and aspects of her testimony were later corroborated by 2 separate witnesses who were known to Kaufman. These blackmail parties offer a window into an operation that would later become more sophisticated and grow dramatically under Rosenstiel's field commander, a nickname given to Rosenstiel to an individual to be named later. I think that individual happens to be Mr. Roy Cohn, who is directly connected to Donald Trump, as he was his lawyer and mentor, as we talked about in earlier episodes. It says many of the people connected to Rosenstiel's field commander during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, rather, have found their names in the press following the recent arrest of Jeffrey Epstein. The untouchable mobster that they're referring to here says Bronfman and Rosenstiel became legendary in the North American liquor business, in part due to their fight for supremacy in the industry. It says they ended up dueling for control, but they were both connected to Meyer Lansky. So Bronfman regularly threw lavish dinner parties in Lansky's honor, both during and after Prohibition. These parties were remembered fondly by Lansky's wife, and in turn, Lansky did favors for Bronfman, ranging from exclusive protection of his shipments during Prohibition to getting them tickets to major fights. Rosenstiel also threw regular dinner parties honoring Lansky. Susan Kaufman, Rosenstiel's ex-wife, claimed to have taken numerous pictures of her ex-husband and Lansky socializing and partying together. And Lansky, per Kaufman's recollection, was one of the individuals that Rosenstiel sought to protect from legal scrutiny as part of his child prostitution and blackmail ring targeting high-ranking officials. And he was overheard saying that if the government ever brings pressure against Lansky or any one of us, we'll use this information as blackmail. Lansky also referred to Rosenstiel as Supreme Commander, and a title that would later be used to refer to Rosenstiel by another individual deeply connected to the mob and sexual blackmail operations, who was referred to as Rosenstiel's field commander. Lansky had ties to the CIA and military intelligence. As we had noted before, the Mary Carter Paint Company's other shareholders included the CIA. So we saw previously the connection between Meyer Lansky and the intelligence community, in particular the CIA. Lansky says, along with his associate Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, worked with naval intelligence in an operation called Operation Underworld. And in a book written by Douglas Valentine called The CIA as Organized Crime, How Illegal Operations Corrupt America and the World, that talks about the very deep, close connection between the mafia and the intelligence community. So the mafia was a huge problem in 1951 when the Guevara Committee was convened, equivalent to terrorism today, but it's a protected branch of the CIA, which was co-opting criminal organizations around the world and using them in its secret war against the Soviets and the Chinese. We'll skip ahead. It talks about how the CIA used organized crime and they cultivated organized crime to try to take down Castro. Says in addition to the CIA, Lansky was also connected to a foreign intelligence through Tibor Rosenbaum, an arms procurer and high-ranking official in Israel's Mossad, whose bank, the International Credit Bank of Geneva, laundered much of Meyer Lansky's money. Okay, so what's key here is that the article is making allusion to the fact that Meyer Lansky had a connection to Israel's Mossad, as we've also seen that Jeffrey Epstein had a connection to Mossad, if not directly being a Mossad agent himself. As we know, he had a relationship with Robert Maxwell, who we know was a Mossad asset, as is likely was his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell. And here we see Meyer Lansky outside the High Court of Israel, where he sought the permission to immigrate in 1972. It said in the book, The Mistress and the Mafia, journalist Ed Reed wrote that Lansky was attempting to entrap powerful people through sexual blackmail as far back as 1939. He had established a drug ring that later involved the OSS, which was a precursor to the CIA, to seduce numerous politicians, army officers, diplomats, and police officials. Eventually, Lansky was credited with obtaining compromising photos of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover sometime in the 1940s, which showed Hoover in some kind of gay situation, according to former Lansky associate, who also said that Lansky often claimed, "I fixed that son of a bitch." The photos showed Hoover engaging in sexual activity with his longtime friend and partner, FBI Deputy Director Clyde Tolson. At some point, these photos fell into the hands of CIA counterintelligence chief James J. Angleton, who showed the photos to other CIA officials. Angleton was in charge of the CIA's relationship with the FBI and Israel's Mossad until he left the agency in 1972. To gangster Frank Costello and Lansky, the ability to corrupt politicians and policemen and judges was fundamental to mafia operations. The way they found to deal with Hoover, according to several mob sources, involved his homosexuality, which they used as blackmail, of course. It says it was also possible that Hoover was ensnared by the mob during Rosentiel's blackmail parties, at which Hoover sometimes found himself in attendance with prominent figures of the mafia. Hoover was said to have worn women's clothing at some of the events, and Meyer Lansky's wife later said that her husband had photos of the former FBI director in drag. Furthermore, Hoover is on record showing an unusual concern in the FBI's handling of Rosentiel's criminal links as early as 1939, the same year that his close associate Lansky was actively orchestrating the sexual blackmail of powerful political figures. It goes on to basically validate that that was the reason why Hoover would never investigate organized crime. Okay, so it makes allusion to the fact that Hoover was a blackmail victim, and here you'll see a picture of J. Edgar Hoover kind of lusting over this young guy. It says that Hoover seemed to embrace the very type of sexual blackmail operation that compromised his own private life, given that he was seen at many of Rosentiel's blackmail parties in the 1950s and 60s, including at venues such as Rosentiel's personal home and later at the Manhattan Plaza Hotel. Hoover's penchant for dressing in drag was also described by two witnesses who were not connected to Susan Kaufman. Soon after their first official meeting, the public relationship between the two men flourished, with Hoover even sending Rosentiel flowers when he fell ill. Summers reported that in 1957, Rosentiel was heard telling Hoover during a meeting, "Your wish is my command." Their relationship remained close and intimate through the 1960s and beyond. So apparently they were both gay. According to journalist and author Burton Hirsch, Hoover was also tied to Sherman Kaminsky, who ran a sexual blackmail operation in New York involving young male prostitutes. That operation was busted and investigated in 1966 extortion probe by Manhattan District Attorney Frank Hogan, though the FBI quickly took over the investigation and photos of Hoover and Kaminsky together soon disappeared from the case file. So there's also more than one documented occasion wherein Hoover attempted to use blackmail to protect Rosenthal and his field commander, who was none other than, as I pointed out earlier, the infamous Roy Cohn, the other key figure in Rosenthal's sexual blackmail operation involving minors. Decades after his death, Roy Cohn remains a controversial figure, in part because of his close personal relationship with current U.S. President Donald Trump. Yet reports on Cohn, both in the past and in recent years, often miss their mark in characterizing him. He was one of the many figures who would surround Jeffrey Epstein, but again, we noted his close relationship to Donald Trump, uh, being again that Roy Cohn was not only a mentor, but he was one of his first lawyers. So it goes into some information about Roy Cohn. Again, it collaborates information that we discussed on Roy Cohn previously. So the dates and circumstances around Cohn's introduction to Rosenthal are hard to come by. It gives information about his father, who was a prominent judge, who was an influential figure in the New York Democratic Party, which I have read about. And it was revealed that the Democratic organization, all right, uh, dominated by Flynn, who became a mentor to Roy Cohn's father, Albert Cohn. They had a close relationship with Meyer Lansky. So what it's saying here is that the New York Democratic Party was heavily influenced by organized crime, principally Meyer Lansky, and that both Rosenthal, Albert Cohn, Roy Cohn's father, and later Roy Cohn were closely connected to. Regardless of how or when it began, the relationship between Cohn and Rosenthal was close and was often likened to that of a father and son, which ended up being the same type of relationship that Donald Trump ended up having with Roy Cohn. They were said to frequently salute each other in public and remain close until Rosenthal was near death, at which point Cohn attempted to trick his barely then conscious and senile friend and client into naming him the executive and trustee of the liquor magnate's estate, valued at $75 million, which ironically is very similar to the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Leslie Wexner. Life magazine reported in 1969 that Cohn and Rosenthal had referred have for years referred to one another as field commander and supreme commander, respectively. Life magazine noted that Meyer Lansky also called Rosenstiel supreme commander, and the fact that Cohen and Rosenstiel would later become intimately involved in the same pedophile sex ring suggests that there may be more to these nicknames. After all, the mob to which Rosenstiel was connected often used military-themed titles like soldier and lieutenant to differentiate the rank and importance of his members. Okay, so it appears here that Roy Cohn and Rosenstiel had these sex parties from which they gathered compromising information, but what's key is that they participated in those parties. Okay, so they were both pedophiles and they were both fond of young boys and were gay. The question is to the relationship between Donald Trump and Cohen. The fact they were like information about Cohen's relationship with Joseph McCarthy, who spent much of his time accused people of communism and trying to bring people down and lead to his downfall. But Cohen was was McCarthy's legal representative. It says after he was forced to, this was the word Cohen, after he was forced to leave McCarthy's side due to the scandal, Cohen returned to New York to live with his. I understand we're having some Wi-Fi issues, um, maybe due to the nature of the subject. I don't know. Anyway, uh, it says that Cohen, after he was forced to leave McCarthy's side due to the nature of the scandal, Cohen returned to New York to live with his mother and practice law. A few years later, New York Judge David Peck, a longtime associate of CIA Director Allen Dulles, orchestrated Cohen's hire to the New York law firm Sachs, Bacon, and O'Shea, which would later become Sachs, Bacon, and Boland after Tom Boland, a friend of Cohen's, became a partner in the firm. Upon his hire, Cohen brought the firm a slew of mafia-linked clients, including high-ranking members of the Gambino crime family, the Genovese crime family, of course, Louis Rosenstiel. The connections Roy Cohn built during the 50s made him a well-known public figure and translated into great political influence that peaked during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. As Cohn built his public image, he was also developing a dark private life, which was soon to be dominated by the same black male pedophile racket that appears to have first begun with Louis Rosenstiel. So Cohn began having black male parties, which we talked about in previous episodes of this series. He hosted them at Manhattan's at the Manhattan Plaza Hotel in Suite 233. Kaufman, who you will recall was one of Rosensteel's wives, I think his fourth wife, described Cohn's suite as a beautiful suite, all done in light blue. She described being introduced to Hoover, who was in drag by Cohn, who told her that Hoover's name was Mary, in a fit of barely concealed laughter. Kaufman testified that young boys were present. Young boys were present, not girls. Young boys were present, and Kaufman claimed that Cohn, Hoover, and her ex-husband engaged in sexual activity with these young boys. New York Attorney John Klotz, tasked with investigating Cohn for a case well after Kaufman's testimony, also found evidence of the blue suite at the Plaza Hotel and its role in the sex extortion ring after combing through local government documents and information gathered by private detectives. Klaus later told journalist and author Burton Hirsch what he learned. Where Cohn was providing protection, there were a bunch of pedophiles involved. That's where Cohn got his power from. Perhaps the most damning information of Cohn's activities in Suite 3 was stating himself to to determine external department human trafficking and violence. Weston later told Camp Nebraska State Senator who investigated government connected child sex ring based in Omaha, another investigator, that Cohn admitted to being part of a sexual blackmail operation targeting politicians, which prostitutes during sit down. Boston told his camp the Cohn's job was with boys. So you had an general or congressman who didn't want to go along with the program. Cohn's job was to set them up, then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself. Rothstein later told Paul David Collins, a former journalist turned researcher, that Cohn had also identified the sexual blackmail operation as part of the anti-communist crusade of the time. The fact that, per Rothstein's recollection, stated that the child sex blackmail ring was part of government-sponsored anti-communist crusade suggests that elements of government, including Hoover's FBI, may have been connected at a much broader level than Hoover's own personal involvement, as the FBI closely coordinated with McCarthy and Cohn for much of the Red Scare. Interesting. In the book by Talbot, The Devil's Chessboard, he makes note of the fact that Senator McCarthy had a habit of molesting young women. He couldn't keep his hands off the young girls. Walter Troy would say, who was the chief of the Chicago Tribune. His observation didn't come near him raised and cried statutory rape out the fact that those planning matters were allies and closest enemies. The question that arises from revelations regarding Cohn's activities in Suite 3 is protecting and assisting these prostitutes. One of them could very well have been one of Cohn's close friends and clients, partner Francis Okay. How about now, Brother Jamal? Can you hear me? I think we're back. So let me pick it up where I think we went out. So we were talking about Roy Cohn having these parties in his hotel, the Plaza Hotel it was, in room 233. And one of the attendees at these parties was one Cardinal Francis Spellman of the Archdiocese of New York. He was one of the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church in North America, who was sometimes referred to as America's Pope. He was accused of not only condoning pedophilia in the Catholic Church and ordaining known pedophiles, including one Cardinal Theodore Uncle Teddy McGarrick, but he also engaged in it himself to such an extent that many New York priests widely referred to him as married. Furthermore, J. Edgar Hoover was said to have a file detailing the Cardinal's sex life, suggesting Spellman's involvement in the ring and pedophile protection racket in which Cohn and Hoover were personally involved. And here you see Cardinal Francis Spellman gathered with some young kids. People close to Cohn often remarked that he was frequently surrounded by groups of young boys, but they seemed to think nothing of it, which brings to mind similar offhanded comments about Epstein's penchant for minors that were made by those close to him prior to his arrest, including those of controversial Republican operative, dirty trickster, and close associate of Donald Trump. The article notes that Roger Stone was also a protege of Roy Cohn, uh, along with Donald Trump. Roger Cohn said the following about Cohn's sex life during an interview with the New Yorker in 2008. Roger Stone says Roy was not gay. He was a man who liked having sex with men. Gays were weak, effeminate. He also seemed to have these young blonde boys around. It just wasn't discussed. He was interested in power and access. Interestingly, the same things were being said about Roger Stone himself, who also claimed not to be gay, but enjoyed the company of young men and boys. Compare this quote. Well, I can't read that one because that quote is blocked out by this, but we'll skip that. Though it is unknown how long the sex ring at the Plaza Hotel continued, again, this is the sex ring at the Plaza Hotel conducted by Roy Cohn, and whether it continued after Cohn's death from AIDS in 1986, it's worth noting that Donald Trump purchased the Plaza Hotel in 1988, and it would later be reported and confirmed by then attendees that Trump used to host parties and suites at the Plaza Hotel when he owned it, where young women and girls were introduced to older, richer men, and illegal drugs and young women were passed around and used. Okay, so for those who would like to say or exonerate Trump from the activities that Epstein was engaged in, we see here that Trump was engaged in similar activities independent of Epstein. Birds of a feather flock together, apparently. Andy Lucchese, a male model who helped organize some of these Plaza Hotel parties for Trump, said the following when asked about the age of the women present. A lot of girls, 14, look 24. That's as juicy as I can get. I never asked how old they were. I just partook. I did partake in activities that would be controversial too. Again, Epstein was not involved, but Trump was having parties similar to the type of parties that Roy Cohn had. The only distinction seems to be that they involved very young girls. But we also know that Roy Cohn was fond of young boys and was a mentor of Trump. Roy Cohn was only at the beginning of his career when he waded into the underground sexual blackmail ring, apparently led by Louis Rosenstiel. Indeed, when Cohn first met Hoover, he was only 23 years old. And over the next 3 decades or so before his death from AIDS-related complications at the age of 56, Cohn had built a well-oiled machine largely through his close friendships with some of the country's most influential figures. Among Cohn's friends were top media personalities like Barbara Walters, former CIA directors former CIA directors. I think he was close friends with the Dulles brothers, possibly George Bush, probably George Bush, because he was also friends with Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, media moguls Rupert Murdoch and Mort Zuckerman, numerous celebrities, prominent lawyers like Alan Dershowitz, who was Epstein's lawyer, top figures in the Catholic Church and leading Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith and the World Jewish Congress, many of the same names that surrounded Cohn until death in the late 1980s would later come to surround Jeffrey Epstein, with the names later appearing in Epstein's now infamous Little Black Book, whose names we read in a previous episode. Reagan meets with Rupert Murdoch, U.S. Information Agency Director Charles Wick, and Roy Cohn, right here, in the Oval Office. While President Trump is clearly connected to both Epstein and Cohn, Cohn's network also extends to former President Bill Clinton, whose friend and longtime political advisor, Richard Dirty Dick Morris, was Cohn's cousin and close associate. Morris was also close to Clinton's former communications director, George Stephanopoulos, who was also associated with Jeffrey Epstein, which goes back to the point I made at the beginning. Two sides of the same coin. They all have the same connections. Yet these were only Cohn's connections to respectable members of the establishment. He was also known for his deep connections to the mob and gained prominence largely for his ability to connect key figures in the criminal underworld to respected, influential figures acceptable to the public sphere. Ultimately, as New York attorney John Klaus stated, Cohn's most powerful tool was blackmail, which he used against friend and foe, gangster or public official alike. How much of that blackmail he acquired through a sexual blackmail operation will likely be never known. But again, whether you consider them to be respectable members of the establishment, that's only on the surface, because they are all connected. The so-called respectable members of the establishment have ties to organized crime. As part 2 of this exclusive investigation revealed, Cohn and Epstein and the sexual blackmail operations they ran shared many things in common, including not only many of the same famous friends and patrons, but also connections to intelligence agencies and consortiums of modeling businessmen, the modern day equivalents of Samuel Bronfman and Louis Rosenthal, who have since been rebranded as philanthropists. As will be shown in the final installment of this report, Epstein is only the latest incarnation of a much older, more extensive, and sophisticated operation that offers a frightening window into how deeply tied the U.S. government is to modern day equivalents of organized crime, making it a racket truly too big to fail. Uh, since this article was written by Whitney Webb, who was then a journalist for the Mint Press News, she has gone on to write this book, One Nation Under Blackmail. Yeah, there you go. One Nation Under Blackmail, which documents and details these connections quite clearly. So I think I'll leave it there, but I'll just kind of give us a preview into the upcoming information that we were not able to get to. This is a powerful article that I came upon. Uh, this one, this one's powerful because it talks about the connection between modeling agencies and sex trafficking. And that's important because Trump owned his own modeling agency. He also ran the Miss American Beauty pageant. It was through his connection to model agencies that he met his wife, Melania. Uh, we don't have time to go through this information. This is a pretty long article, but it's very, very interesting and draws the connection of how Trump ended up being in association with Epstein. So that's going to be a powerful information source of information that we'll get to. Next time we'll have Whitney Webb again. This will bring us to the current day, talking about J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel being basically a member of the new establishment and a primary figure in J.D. Vance's life and a major financier of the Trump campaign. And I think next time we'll go into this one. This is volume 2 of One Nation Under Blackmail. And in this chapter goes into, you'll see information on Epstein, draws the relationship between Epstein and Clinton and organizations that they had in common. You'll see allusions to Adnan Khashoggi, who sold his yacht to Donald Trump, who also had a close association with Roy Cohn. Yeah, here we go. Khashoggi's infamous yacht would be sold to Roy Cohn's protege, Donald Trump. So this is a short preview. You see, it talks about Cohn and his involvement in blackmail. Uh, it talks about BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce, which was euphemistically known as the Bank of Crooks and Criminals International. Yeah, so we'll be going into this information the next time. Otherwise, we'll be here until 10 o'clock. So with that, I think we'll close out. We apologize for the technical difficulties, but we'll see you back here next time on Journey into Self, where we will continue on, I guess, episode 15 this time, or 16, is it? Will it be, Brother Jamal, of our discussion on Donald Trump, outsider or establishment? All right. So with that, um, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time here on Journey into Self. What's up?